Well, thank you for coming to our 5th IRIS seminar hosted by ConocoPhillips. We're so thankful for the support. I want to welcome you on behalf of Haskayne and take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Blackfoot, people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. We'd also like to note that the University of Calgary is situated on land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and that the traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohkinstsis, which we now call the City of Calgary. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. So, in the series of feedback we've received, and I just want to draw to your attention that you will have seen the cards on your seat for feedback, so I encourage you to give us feedback after this. Let us know how it went, topics you want in the future. One of them was around environmental audits, and what can a company do, or what is the role of a company from a practitioner perspective. So we have today a speaker that I've had the pleasure to work with. We've gone out to the field together, in fact. I sometimes describe it as he was the good cop, and I was the bad cop coming in after to enforce things. We had different roles, but what a great individual I've had the pleasure of knowing for a while. Evan is a senior consultant and assurance practice lead with Span Consulting Calgary, over 3 decades of experience, and I've learned so much from him over the years. He's been involved in environmental auditing in oil and gas, power generation, water and wastewater, wind energy, and other industries. He's a double alumni of U of C with a Bachelor of Science and Masters of Science in Geography. I'm going to invite him up here, but before I do, I almost always forget to tell everybody that although we're going to have the slides here, they will be available to you to download later. So don't feel you have to take pictures of the slides or, oh, what's that word? I'm squinting to look at it. They will be available for download along with this. So with that, join me in welcoming Evan Baker to the stage.
Thanks very much, David. It's a great pleasure to be here today. It's good of you all to come out and on a nice day. I see there's even people here that I didn't pay, so it's great to see you here. Environmental auditing is a subject that I've been involved in for a large part of my career, something that I'm very passionate about as a result. I've seen a lot of changes in environmental auditing, and I see changes still happening. So I'm going to be giving you my perspective as a practitioner in environmental auditing over the years, some of the things that I've gone through and some of the changes I've seen, not only in auditing, but also in regulations, which are a big driver for environmental auditing. So, our questions for today. What are we talking about? These are some of the things I'm going to be going through. What are we talking about in terms of environmental auditing? What is an environmental audit? Where have we been? So a bit of a history lesson for you today. Where we've been with auditing and with regulations in the past. Where are we at today? And a little bit about where are we going. And then ultimately through all of that, try to perhaps answer some questions about are we making a difference with environmental auditing? So what are we talking about? What is an environmental audit anyway? If I was to go back 30 years ago and say, can you please use the words environmental and audit in the same sentence? My guess is that it might have been a little difficult. After all, environment is the bugs and bunnies, the birds and bees, and all that good stuff. And audit is something that you don't want to hear from Revenue Canada, right? We're going to do an audit. Nowadays, if I said, can you use those 2 words in the same sentence? My guess is probably you could. You might know that there is something called an environmental audit. You might not know exactly what is involved in an environmental audit, but it's something that's at least a little bit more in the lexicon today. So we're going to talk a little bit about how auditing has changed and about how regulation has evolved in North America, what is driving some of those changes historically in regulation in North America, and then what is industry's response in terms of things like management systems and audits, and how does the industry make use of these. So I'm going to give you a definition. I promise this is the only definition I'm going to give you today. This is a definition of an environmental audit out of a standard called ISO 19011. And I'll talk a little bit more about the ISO standards a little bit later on. So let me just pull a few words out of this definition. First of all, An environmental audit is systematic. It is not just you and I deciding we should go out and take a look at something one particular day. There is a very defined system and process to conducting an environmental audit, and companies generally know what that process is. So it's defined through standards like ISO 19011. An audit is independent. After all, Revenue Canada wouldn't say, hey, can you do an audit on that tax return you filed with us last year? Sure, I'd be glad to do that. But that would not be an audit. An audit should be conducted by someone who is independent of the work that is being looked at. So that is a key aspect of auditing. During an audit, I look for audit evidence. I don't very often use the word evidence when I'm doing an audit and interacting with people on an audit. It's not exactly a word people want to hear, but fundamentally that's what I'm doing. I'm looking for evidence about whether the operations that I'm auditing are complying with whatever the criteria are that I'm auditing against. So those criteria could then be regulations, they could be management system requirements, they could be standards such as CSA standards, but the idea of an audit isn't we're just looking at things randomly. We have criteria. I'm trying to see how well we're complying to those criteria. So that's just a bit of background on what an environmental audit is. The term environmental auditing was coined mainly in the United States in the 1970s, largely as a bit of a defense mechanism for the huge amount of environmental regulation that was being developed. If I was to take a period from, say, about the mid-1960s through the 1990s, we sort of went from a state where there was virtually no environmental regulation to the point where there was all of the basic environmental regulation had been developed. It's still been evolving since that time, but I would say during that period of time, mid-60s to mid-90s, was when the great basis of regulation was developed. So if I was to look at the Code of Federal Regulation in the United States in 1975, there was about 300 pages of environmental regulations. Fast forward 20 years to 1995, and that had grown to 12,500 pages of environmental regulation. I look for statistics on how much there is now, but it's hard to sort of compartmentalize some of the regulation that has so many environmental implications these days. But suffice it to say, there was a tremendous growth in environmental regulation over that time period. In addition to federal regulations, there are also state legislation. In the US, a lot of the regulation tends to be dominantly federal, but there is also state legislation, and jurisdiction is important. If you think about things like Keystone Pipeline that may have got federal consent, then it still has to deal with the state of Nebraska and go through their regulations. So there is a combination of both federal, provincial, state in the case of the US, and even municipal regulation that you have to be able to navigate your way through. Some of those key pieces of regulation that evolved in the United States, the Clean Air Act and the Water Quality Act in 1963 and 1965, and I'll come back to them in a couple of minutes. NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, and establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency. That took place in 1970. Anybody here tell me who was the president in 1970 that established this? Beg pardon? Richard Nixon, exactly. So not exactly what we remember Richard Nixon for. Richard Nixon may not have really been the driver behind the EPA, but he was the president at the time the EPA was established. And the idea of the EPA was to pull together a bunch of different agencies and into one central agency that had a greater jurisdiction over federal regulations. Some of the other ones here, if I go down through the list, the one on the bottom, the Superfund, or CERCLA, Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. This is a pretty important one that I will get back to again a little bit later in my presentation as well. In Canada, the formation of agencies and regulations tended historically to lag somewhat behind or to follow evolution of regulations in the United States. If I take a look at some of the agencies that have been established here in Canada, the Alberta Petroleum and Natural Gas Conservation Board, which then became the ERCB, which became the AEUB, which is now the AER, or the Alberta Energy Regulator, was first established in about 1938. So we've got quite a long history of regulation for oil and gas here in Alberta. The National Energy Board was established in 1959 and apparently is going to be dissolved in 2018, according to the new regulations that are coming in. And in its place will be the CER, the Canadian the Energy Regulator. Thank you all. So we're going to see a change there. Environment Canada was established in 1971. So 1 year after the formation of the EPA in the United States, under, here's your next trivia question, which Prime Minister? One of those Trudeaus, Pierre Trudeau in 1971. Looking at some of the legislation that's been passed over that time period, just to pick out a couple to take a look at. One that I think is particularly interesting is the Migratory Birds Convention Act. This is an act that was established on the basis of what's called the Migratory Birds Convention, which is a treaty between Canada and the US. That treaty was in 1916. Many of you might know this as the main piece of legislation that governs hunting of migratory waterfowl in Canada. Well, it's essentially the same on both sides of the border. There's fundamentally parallel legislation, the Migratory Birds Convention Act in Canada, established in 1917, and a similar piece of legislation established in the US, both looking at this international treaty. So there's a lot of other treaties. Canada is a signatory to over 130 different bilateral and multilateral treaties. There's things like the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, Convention on Biological Diversity. There's something called the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Wastes and Their Disposal, which you might not think would possibly apply to recyclables, but we'll get back to that in a few minutes. Convention on Trade in Endangered Species, Nuclear Safety, and of course the Montreal Protocol on protection of substances that deplete the ozone layer. So with all these different conventions and treaties that we have, of course, there needs to be a development of regulations and laws that will support these different international treaties. Here in Canada, provinces own a lot of the environmental law. I would say in balance, in the US, there tends to be a predominance of federal legislation environmentally, whereas in Canada, there is much more provincial legislation that we have to live with, just the way that our system is set up. And as an example, Alberta, partly because of its basis in agriculture prior to natural gas, was the first province in Canada to establish legislation in 1963 about reclamation of land. So that was the Surface Reclamation Act, and then that was followed in 1969 by the Public Lands Act. And of course, there's been a lot of other pieces of legislation since that time as well. So that's a little bit of a background to some of the main pieces of legislation that have evolved over time. And of course, as I've said, it keeps happening. What's driving all of this regulatory change? Well, there's a few different mechanisms for regulatory change. Public awareness, environmental activism, environmental events are three of them that we'll talk about a little bit. In 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, a book that really raised public awareness around the use of pesticides in the environment, particularly focusing on the use of DDT. You remember back in that list of US legislation, the Clean Air Act in 1963 and the Water Quality Act in 1965, those were largely driven, or at least somewhat driven, by the increasing awareness that was brought about by the publishing of Silent Spring. So that's kind of a landmark book. It took a little while longer before DDT was actually banned. It was only in the early 1970s its use was restricted, and 1980s before it was actually banned. And that's actually still controversial in some circles, that DDT is banned, because some people believe there's still valid uses for it. Environmental activism and groups. When we think about environmental activist groups, there's been a change over time in this as well. If we take a look back historically, a lot of the groups tended to be conservation based. So you had groups like the Audubon Society was established in 1905. The Nature Conservancy in 1951, the World Wildlife Fund in 1961. So these organizations based in fundamental conservation. In the 1960s, we started to see a move towards a little bit more activist type of environmental groups. So one of the ones was the Environmental Defense Fund, initiated in 1967 in the US. And that group was also instrumental in the push to ban DDT. Here in Canada, one of the ones that we know about, a pretty activist type of group, Greenpeace, was formed in 1971 in Vancouver. And of course, since then, there's continued to be a lot more groups that have evolved over time. So that's some of the sort of environmental activism and awareness historically. Let's take a look at a few significant events, or you might call them trigger events or environmental events. A lot of us tend to think about offshore oil drilling as something that's relatively new, but in fact it's been around for a long time. In 1969, a Union Oil platform about 10 kilometers off the coast of Santa Barbara resulted in the release of between 80 and 100,000 barrels of oil. And a lot of that washed up on the beaches of Santa Barbara County. So it's something that has been an issue for quite a period of time. Allied Chemical, this is kind of an interesting one. Allied Chemical had a release of a toxic pesticide called Kepone into the James River and ultimately into Chesapeake Bay, so fairly near Washington, fairly visible. What's interesting, I think, about this is that the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission in the United States, got involved, because this was, we normally think of the SEC as governing basically stocks and bonds and the financial aspects, but they look at risks that are associated and whether these risks are being properly reported. So they got involved, and ultimately Allied Chemical was charged with violations of over 1,000 counts of pollution. And they were convicted. I'm not sure how many they were convicted on, but they were found guilty on some of those. Ones that are probably a little better known to us, Love Canal in 1976, Hooker Chemical. Love Canal near Niagara Falls, New York. There had been years and years of contamination, and it was only in 1976 that contamination was eventually exposed. You remember a few slides ago I talked about CERCLA, the Superfund in the US. This was one of the first areas where the Superfund was actually applied, so that public monies were then dedicated to cleaning up Love Canal. It took until 2004 before that cleanup was ultimately finished at Love Canal. So these big contamination events can take an awful long time to clean up. One that we're probably all familiar with, the Exxon Valdez in 1989 ran aground off Bligh Reef in Prince William Sound, resulted in a spill of between 1/4 to 1/2, perhaps more than 1/2 million barrels of crude oil. And of course, this is one that we can all remember was before the times of social media, but conventional media, we certainly saw the images of animals, ducks covered in oil washing up on the beaches. Certainly a significant event. This resulted in the creation of the U.S. Oil Pollution Act 1 year later. So there was the event, and then there was legislation that came on its heels. A little closer to home, Bata Shoe Canadian Shoe Company in 1989 were storing drums of toxic nasties on the shores of Lake Ontario without a secondary containment, without any weather protection, and that leaked into the groundwater. And they were eventually charged under the Ontario Water Resources Act and probably a couple of other acts as well. Interesting thing about this one is that 2 directors of the company were charged with failing to take reasonable care to prevent this pollution discharged, and they were convicted. So this is one of the first ones that really started to catch the attention of boards of directors and directors of company, that they could be held directly liable for the actions in their companies. So that's a few examples. Let's take a quick look at what that whole cycle of regulatory change is. So the significant event, a focusing event, takes place. There's a social reaction. Nowadays, that social reaction is almost instantaneous. Everybody's got a camera. Everybody can communicate those images just like that. Social reaction then results in a regulatory response, typically a regulatory change. That's not exactly instantaneous. It can take several years before regulations are in fact developed. But the regulatory change then results in some sort of an industry response. The industry says, okay, we've got new regulations, we have to find a way to deal with this. Tends to be a little bit more resistance often at first. Oh my God, how are we going to be able to do this? But in my experience, within a few years of a regulatory change, it's just, this is the way that we now do business. We have new regulations. This is the way we have to operate if we're going to be a business. There's also that gradual awareness that can take place over a period of time. That gradual awareness can then also trigger regulatory change. It doesn't have to be one super event. It can be a growth of knowledge over a period of time. And I think probably climate change fits into that, where there isn't a significant event, but is a general growth of understanding around climate change. And then sometimes social reaction doesn't necessarily have to go through regulatory change in order to make an impact on industry and have that industry respond. Sometimes it can be much more direct. And industry can in fact respond directly to a focusing event. There's probably going to be social reaction as well, but an industry might look at something and say, okay, we have to do something here. So that's just some of the pathways. And I've drawn these all as one directional, but in fact, there's probably feedback in all of these. A social reaction might cause an industry response. Industry responds. Change in social reaction depending on how well industry responds to them, just as an example. Let's take a look at a few of the changes and some more significant events. Anybody here been watching The Crown on Netflix? Oh, there's a few in the back, some dedicated fans. You may remember in the first season of The Crown in 1952, there was a particularly nasty weather event. I think it was probably a very severe inversion, something like that. And it resulted in the Great London Fog of 1952, or the Great London Smog. It killed 4,000 people, over a period of time and directly, 4,000 people. So it took a few years, but that resulted in the Clean Air Act in Great Britain in 1956. So there was a bit of a lag there, but changes in the regulations. A little bit closer to today, Deepwater Horizon in 2010 resulted in the release of between 4 and 5 million barrels of oil. Absolutely massive. But it did result in change in standards around blowout preventers and well casing requirements. So there's a change that resulted from that one. Lac Megantic has been back in the news lately. Obviously a horrible disaster resulting from train cars loaded with oil running into Lac Megantic. It's just been in the news again lately as it came to court. That resulted in a change in rail car standards, the old DOT 111 standard in the US, and I don't know exactly what the equivalent is in Canada, But those cars are being phased out, if they haven't been already, and I'm not quite sure, in favor of new cars that have different standards for keeping the oil in the car. So sometimes it's a significant event. Sometimes an event can take a little bit longer to trigger the changes. In 2006, an Alberta delegation went to Washington for the Folklife Festival. They took with them one of these massive CAT 777 trucks, and they parked it on the Washington Mall. And along with them went King Ralph of the Grand Duchy of Alberta, to great fanfare. However, at that time, and at this time, the oil sands were largely still seen as a technological marvel rather than a pariah. But at the time, it attracted the attention of the Natural Resource Defense Council, and they came up with the headline, "Alberta Tar Sands Feeds U.S. Addiction to Oil." You can look back on that now and see that as maybe that was a bit of a trigger in itself. 2 years later, Premier Stelmach also went down to Washington, and he was met with placards and protesters. And the Canadian arm of the Environmental Defense Fund wrote a report calling the oil sands the most destructive project on Earth. And we know where that dialogue has gone since then. Syncrude, 2008. Probably we all remember there was a 1,600 ducks that were migrating and were forced down by nasty weather conditions, and the cannons, which were supposed to be in place to scare them away from the tailings ponds, weren't operating properly. As a result, those ducks landed on the tailings pond, and quite a number of them perished. So this is an example of maybe not a change in legislation, but a perceived change in the enforcement of legislation. You remember I talked about the Migratory Birds Convention Act in Canada. So that was the main piece of legislation, and Alberta PIA, under which Syncrude was charged, and they eventually were convicted under that, and they paid a $3 million fine. So that certainly catches companies' attention. They don't like being convicted. They don't like being charged with criminal acts. So let's take that idea of significant events and start to look at environmental auditing and management systems. Can anybody here tell me what happened in Bhopal, India in 1984? So it was a union, that's right, it was a union carbide gas release, something called methyl isocyanate. I have no idea what methyl isocyanate is, other than it's nasty. Up to 500,000 people were exposed to this release of methyl isocyanate, and depending on whether you look at the immediate effects or the long-term effects, between 2,000 and 10,000 people died as a result of this release from union carbide. That certainly caught a lot of people's attention, and there were regulatory changes that came about in India. But the change I want to focus on is the company response. In fact, the industry response. Because the chemical industry took a look at the reaction and what was going on. And in particular in Canada, the CCPA, the Canadian Chemical Producers Association, developed something that's called responsible care. Responsible care is a series of standards on how they should manage their chemicals. They're now called codes, standards codes, but basically it's a fundamental management system framework. This is the things we should do to protect people, to communicate with people, to transport our chemicals safely. So this is the beginning of one of the first industry-wide management systems. Under responsible care, you are compelled, if you want to stay a member of the association, you're compelled to do audits against those standards. Every 3 years, you also require an external audit against those standards. And if you go on the Responsible Care website, you can look at all those external audit reports because they are published on the website. So it's very, very public. Responsible Care started in Canada, as I said, then it moved into the United States, and responsible care is now practiced in 53 different countries around the world under an International Chemical Association banner. So this was one of those real triggering events that resulted in significant changes and the development of a management system. Some of the other changes that brought about management systems, Exxon Valdez, the fallout from that. Exxon developed something called OIMS, the Operations Integrity Management System. If you work for Exxon, pretty much everything you do, from requisitioning a stapler to loading something up with oil, is going to be somehow covered in this massive series of binders, I'm sure it's all online now, of the Operations Integrity Management System. So Exxon made that move to say, we are going to standardize everything we do in this company. It doesn't matter where you are, this is the way that Exxon operates. So Exxon is a company that moved in this direction quite a long time ago. There are also international standards called, from the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. And these are standards around management systems and guidance documents. The first ones came out in the 1980s. ISO 9000 was for quality management systems. They were followed in the 1990s by ISO 14000, standard for environmental management systems. There are other standards. 19011 is the standard I mentioned earlier that says this is how you do an audit. ISO 14064 is for greenhouse gas verification, validation, quantification, reporting, how you do it. 19600 is compliance management systems. And there are other organizations who have now developed standards. The OGP 510 standard is for operational management systems. So there's a lot of guidance out there now that companies can use to develop their management systems. In my experience, the oil and gas industry has been somewhat slow to embrace the concept of management systems. They're getting there, but one of the drivers for example, ISO 9000 and 14000 is a company could be certified to that. That generally is driven by a customer saying, I'm not going to buy from you unless I know that you have a quality management system and you're following it, or an environmental management system and you're following it. That's what drives a lot of the certification. The oil and gas industry doesn't have that identifiable customer that is saying thou shalt be certified to ISO 14000 or I'm not going to buy your oil. So as a result, oil and gas companies have generally said, well, we're going to develop a management system, we'll sort of follow 14000, but we're basically going to build it ourselves. Sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. I've seen both ends of the spectrum. I've seen management systems that worked well, and I've seen some that were just terrible to try to follow, and they tend to fall apart, and then a company might have to try again. So along with management systems, we're back to audits, because that's a component of management systems. So who does them? In my experience, most oil and gas companies do audits to some extent. Certainly all the majors and most of the mid-sized companies. Sometimes they are part of a defined, planned system where the audits are scheduled, they're planned out. There's a schedule year over year for what's going to be audited. Sometimes it tends to be much more haphazard, like, oh, this happened, I think we should go out and do an audit and figure out why. Or maybe we have a contractual obligation to our partners to do an environmental audit. So there's quite a range of drivers for audits and acceptance of audits within not only oil and gas industry, but I've audited in a lot of other industries as well. It's just oil and gas is a little bit closer to home for most of us. In addition to companies doing audits, the regulators do audits. The Alberta Energy Regulator has tended to rely more on inspections from their field officers, but the AER can also do application audits. They can do area emissions audits. They can do remediation reclamation audits. So they do have that capability, and I think they've been moving more in that direction. And in particular lately, focusing around something called safety and loss management systems and requirements for audits there. That's sort of an emerging thing right now. So the AER does audits. The National Energy Board, which is the regulator for what we would typically think of as the big pipes, the Trans-Canada, the Trans-Mountain, anything that crosses a provincial or an international border is going to be under the jurisdiction of the National Energy Board until this year. and now it's going to be a different regulator. But they have a little bit different history embedded within regulation. The onshore pipeline regulations that companies are required to comply with basically says a company must have a management system. A company must have 6 defined programs. There's environment, safety, security, integrity, damage prevention, and one other that I can't remember. They must have programs. They must do audits against those programs. And in fact, they must do audits of the audit program as well. So they are compelled by regulation to do these audits. And the National Energy Board, in turn, does audits of companies. And when they come in and do an audit, one of the things that they are looking for is, has the company got an audit program? Have they done the audits? Have they developed action plans? Have they carried out those action plans to make the corrections that are there? So even though the OPR is not the onshore pipeline regulation is not particularly detailed, there's a lot of power in what it compels companies to do in order to look after its operations. In addition to that, who audits the regulators? Well, the Auditor General audits the regulators. In 2015, the Auditor General of Canada did an audit of the National Energy Board, and what they concluded was that they didn't adequately track company implementation of approval conditions or consistently follow up on deficiencies in company compliance with regulatory requirements. They didn't say the companies were not compliant. They said you're not doing a good enough job of following up and making sure that they are in compliance with those requirements. So that was the Auditor General of Canada. The Auditor General of Alberta in the same year also did an audit of the Alberta Energy Regulator. Generally, they concluded we've got a good system, but they did find some faults. The AER doesn't have a structured process to identify, rank, and target key pipeline operational risks and integrate them into the operational plan. So this is where this new safety loss management system, I think, is being driven out of some of these results of the audits. So that's a little bit of the history and structure of audits. Let's take a look at some things happening now and maybe ask a few questions. I don't know how many people heard of the collision on January 6th of this year between the Iranian tanker, the Sanchi, and another ship. It ended up with all 32 crew members killed and the release of more than the Exxon Valdez, approximately 1 million barrels of not crude oil, but condensate. Condensate doesn't act the same way that crude oil does. Not as much is known about how condensate will react in an aquatic environment. But this sort of came on the 6th, sort of heard about it in the news on maybe the 7th. I haven't heard a whole lot about it since then. So where's the outcry from this one? It's not on our shores, right? This is off the coast of China. So to me, this is a little bit of out of sight, out of mind in terms of what we are hearing about. What changes this one will bring about, I don't know. But it tended to fade from sight fairly quickly. Other things that maybe make you go, Remember I mentioned that convention on the transboundary movement of hazardous waste? Well, I don't think it actually applies in this case, but recently we've heard that all our recyclables, most of which are shipped off to China, they've hit the reject button. They're saying these are contaminated recyclables. They're not pure enough for us to be able to take and process in China. So as a result, they're all piling up down at the Shepherd recycling plant down in southeast Calgary, trying to figure out how we can get rid of these recyclables. So what's the problem here? Is it that we don't have some place to take them? Well, we did, but they said they're not being managed properly enough. You and I are all paying for this on our monthly bills. Where is the oversight about how these things are being managed? Is there some assurance that should be happening from that pickup to the point where they get being packaged up to head overseas? This is one that baffles me a little bit. I have to thank somebody else for bringing this one to my attention. Bitcoin. I don't know if anybody here owns Bitcoin. I certainly don't have no comprehension of how it works. But apparently how it works is through mining of computer systems, through this blockchain technology. And it requires a huge amount of energy. If you go on to the website of Digiconomist, you'll see these graphs of how much energy is being consumed in this massive trading that's going back and forth, and it's an exponential curve. If this curve was to continue on the projection that it is, by 2019, it would consume as much energy as the entire United States does now, and by 2020, as much energy as the entire world. Is that fake news? I don't know, but that's, when you look at the graphs, that's some of the projections. This is a largely unregulated industry. So where's the oversight of this? It's starting to be developed. What about the CO2 emissions that are being generated from supplying all of these computers? Those CO2 emissions are probably a lot more than what's being generated as part of our oil and gas, if you were to project it out that way. So some of these things that are happening that are below the radar and have no real assurance. So with that, I want to try to wrap it up with a bit of discussion about where have we been, where are we at now, what are some of the changes that are going on. When I first started auditing, I thought that this is something that maybe a few of the very largest companies would undertake. The changes that I've seen is that most companies, if you look around town, have an auditing program of some sort right now, along with different assurance activities. So I've seen that change. When I would go to a site and talk to an operator, if I'm going back 25 years ago, I wouldn't exactly get a warm welcome. Operators and folks at site had a different perspective on environmental issues than they do now. And so it would often be very difficult to get information. And part of that was a fear that the supervisor would go up one side of them and down the other if they were telling me something they thought they shouldn't. And in fact, I've seen that happen a number of occasions. What I've seen now is that I'll go out to a site, A, the old guard is gone, or B, the ones that aren't gone, to their credit, most of them have changed their perspective on environmental issues and have a lot more ownership of it. To the point where often I'll go out to a site and someone will say, "You're the auditor. Hey, come here. Something I want to show you over here. I've been trying to get this fixed for years and I can't seem to get it in the budget. Maybe if you put it in your audit report, I can finally get this thing fixed." Well, that's a bit of a double-edged sword to an auditor. It's great information. It gives me something I might not have had previously, but as an auditor, you always have to take the perspective, trust but verify. What they're telling me might not be accurate, and in fact, it might not be relevant to the audit that I'm doing. So there's both good and bad involved in that. But much better ownership of issues environmentally. It used to be that there were very poor mechanisms for follow-up of audit findings. I can recall going out to a site for one particular company in town, went out to a gas plant, wrote up the audit report, left it with them. 3 years later, I walked back onto that site and I said, "That's the first thing that was on my audit report 3 years ago." "Oh, geez, sorry about that, we'll fix it right now." There were very poor mechanisms for follow-up on audit results. Things were basically done on spreadsheets, written down. Things got dropped halfway through if budget wasn't there, and a lot of things really never got followed up on at all. What I see now is that there are much better mechanisms for follow-up. Either there's dedicated auditing software that follows the audit right through from the protocol development to the findings, and other software that's tracking systems where here's the audit finding, here's who's responsible for it, here's the action, here's when it's due, and then tracking systems that will bug you until you've somehow managed to put in, this is what we've done. So those tracking systems are much, much better, and I have much more confidence that things are actually getting addressed these days. Oops, sorry, I'm going to back up a bit. A few other examples. It used to be I could write 3 or 4 audit findings before I walked on site because I got them every single time. And when I got systemic findings, it was usually huge gaps in their overall systems. Nowadays, those little audit findings are gone, again, because of technology. There's a lot of programs that handle things like material safety data sheets. Everybody's got it in a program. They don't have to keep updating it manually. And where there's a gap in the system, it's usually a relatively small gap in the system. So I have seen changes over time. I have seen improvements. People in companies have much greater ownership of environmental issues. It's not just the environmental department anymore that was created to start to deal with all of this. It tends to be distributed much more broadly within companies, and there's a greater understanding. Some of the things I see coming in the future, carbon accounting. With all the changes in climate change legislation, everybody has to account for their carbon footprint. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors in this one, folks, but in order to properly account for all the carbon, there's a lot of detailed calculations, and generally it's required to have verification, third-party verification of those calculations. Sustainability reporting. Companies have sustainability reports, corporate responsibility reports, using standards like the Global Reporting Initiative, Dow Jones Sustainability Index, B Corp. Those typically require some sort of a third-party verification. They've got a lot more substance to them now than they did when they first started out. There's actual claims of particular improvements in them, and they need to be verified. Materiality assessment. Remember I mentioned the SEC and allied chemicals? Companies need to account for their environmental risks and the materiality of those risks. And in order to do that, there should be some sort of verification of what those risks are. Think of climate change again and being able to account for climate risks. How in the world does a company account for that within their financial reporting, requiring verification? So those are just a few of the changes that I've seen. I guess the last one I've seen is that environmental audit and internal audit used to be two solitudes. Internal audit is the ones that you think of as the financial auditing arm of a company, and SOX auditing. They didn't used to talk to each other. Now they're talking to each other. There's more understanding between those two groups about this is what you're looking at, this is what I'm looking at. And in fact, I've seen in some companies that those auditing arms are in fact coming together and they're both being managed out of the same department. And I think there's a lot of benefit to, if not being in the same department, certainly to communication between those groups, helping companies to keep an eye on their overall operations. So that's a good thing. And with that, I will open it up to discussion. And while you've got questions, I'll put the obligatory commercial up for you all to look at. Thank you.
Thank you for the nice awareness. Can you please shed some light on the flip side of the picture? In one of your slides, you were saying that the gradual awareness leads to the regulations. So you mean that it could be the gradual awareness did not reach to the White House, that he is still saying that climate change is a fake news? I hope you get my question.
I get your question. I don't think I can shed any light on that. That's totally baffling to me, frankly.
No, I mean the other side or other perspective, the counter perspective of climate change, that there is not really affecting our environment, this climate change and CO2.
I can't claim to be an expert in climate change. I'm probably going to dodge that one. Certainly, what I will say is that the whole climate change issue is driving an awful lot of change in regulation. If in fact is something that is a fabrication, then we're doing a lot of changes in regulation that maybe aren't required, but I wouldn't venture to say they shouldn't be required.
One of the questions that was sent to me is, can the environmental audit, of which you're a subject matter expert, be a useful proactive tool to inform operations when it comes to their effects? And it kind of seems that it's most successful as a reactive tool at the moment. Can it become a proactive tool?
Yeah, really good question. There's a couple of different answers to that one. It can become a proactive tool in that during an environmental audit, one of the benefits that I really see is that as I'm interacting with people on the floor of the plant and in the oil field, as I'm asking them questions, I'm creating an awareness there. Sometimes they may not know exactly what all the regulations are. They've just got, this is the way that I have to do this job. That's what I'm told to. And when I'm interacting with them, I'm beginning to create an understanding of why do they do that job that way. I think an audit protocol, which is all those series of questions I'm asking, is a great tool for operations if they can take the time to use it and say, okay, this is what we have to do. Are we doing it through our operations? Second part of my answer to that is operationally, I haven't really talked about it in this talk at all, but audits are only the peak of the pyramid when it comes to assurance. Most of the assurance a company does should be happening not independently from the auditors, but it should be happening embedded within the organization so that companies understand what are their controls, what are the inspections and the evaluations and the assessments that they should be doing within their own operations day to day, so that they have a much greater check, so that when the audit comes, there's nothing left because the rest of their assurance program is so good, it's got everything else covered off. That's what I would like to see us get to. That's really what I'm most involved with. Yes, I do audits in my consultancy, but I'm much more interested in helping companies get that bigger understanding of getting assurance activities embedded throughout their organizations.
I'd like to thank you for a really nice overview of the history of environmental progress. But it kind of seems to me that it's maybe a little rosy. Everything is always getting better. And I'm thinking of maybe the backpedaling under Harper and in the States under Bush. And I'm kind of wondering if you want to comment on that. It goes up and sometimes it comes down, and what has been the result from the industry sort of thing.
So let me take one example that just pops into my head as a result of the changes that were announced in federal legislation the other day. One of the changes was change to the Fisheries Act. During the Harper government, the Fisheries Act was changed so that it was less restrictive. It focused more on commercial and recreational fisheries, and they took out something that was called HAD, hazardous, alteration, disruption, and disturbance. Thank you. That's coming back in. So there are changes depending on the government there were changes made under that government, and it looks like some of those are going to be changed again to be more restrictive. You might look at the opposite situation in the United States, where there were restrictive changes that came in under the Obama legislation that are being repealed or rolled back under the Trump legislation. None of them specific ones occur to mind right now, but certainly I think that depending on jurisdictions, we do have that push-pull going on. So I think overall there's a general growth, but just like a stock chart, if you take a look at it, you've got the ups and downs along the way.
You just referred to the new regulations brought in by the federal government for major projects.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I noticed is that they've dropped environmental impact, and they've dropped environmental assessment,
Yes.
and replaced it with impact assessment. Can you comment what that means?
I was interested when I read that as well. So we used to have the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act and Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency that administered that act. We now have the Canadian Impact Assessment Act and Impact Assessment Agency. So as you say, environment has been dropped. I think what it does is it makes the potential for a broader look at types of impacts, whether they're environmental, whether they're social, whether they're economic. Those could always be in there previously, but I think this just makes it much more overt, looking at both positive or negative and positive impacts, not just environmental, but from all these different aspects. That's, at first blush, that's what I'm reading into it.
I just had one question for you, and it relates to investor liability and particularly the exposure around investments with environmental risk. And have you seen much evolution in that area?
I'd have to say I haven't been very much involved with that myself. I've been pulled in on a couple of assessments, actually driven out of the SEC for oil sands operations, and assessing environmental risks to add to their report that went to the SEC. It's not really my forte, so I haven't been pulled into it very much, and I don't really know the mechanisms by which the environmental risks have been assessed. I think probably a lot of the bigger firms, you know, the Ernst & Youngs, the KPMGs, my guess is that they would tend to get more involved in that in their bigger auditing operations.
Or being assessed as impairment charges on the, you know, on the investment frontier?
Oh yeah, I've heard of it, but honestly, no, nothing I can really speak to well. David might be able to.
Yeah, I was just going to mention on behalf of somebody else who's not here today, Peter Terzakian, we did a session together, and he mentioned all the rounds that he did with investors as of late. They're looking at two things. One is your low-cost position on something, and a high sustainability, environmental, and social mitigation plan. So if you have those two things and you can explain it, you will be looked at for funding. Miss one or the other, and you will not. So that's the investment environment out of San Francisco, New York, and he's saying London as well. So I know I'm speaking on his behalf without him here, but I think he'd be comfortable with me saying so.